Okay, let's get started. I welcome everyone to a book talk with Dr. Hendrik Spruyt on his new award-winning book, The World Imagined, Collective Beliefs and Political Order in Sinocentric, Islamic, and Southeast Asian International Societies. My name is C.W.Lim, and I'm an associate professor of international relations and C.W.Lim and KF professor of Korean studies at American University School of International Service. Today, I have the privilege of moderating what promises to be a fascinating conversation on a very important book. I am very honored to be joined by Dr. Hendrik Spruyt, our speaker, and Dr. Antje Wiener and Jessica Auchter. Unfortunately, Patrick Jackson, our colleague, could not join us due to his personal circumstances, but he has sent me his comments so that I can read them on his behalf. Before we go on, let me cover two housekeeping business. One, this event will last for about 90 minutes. We'll start with Hendrik's presentation. He's going to give a PowerPoint presentation. And then I will invite our discussant, Antje and Jessica, and I will read out Patrick's comments. And then we're gonna move on to Q&A at the end for about 20 minutes. If you like to ask a question, please submit it through the chat function or raise your hand using raise hands function in the chat box in the bottom of the Zoom window. And please note that we will turn on the chat function once we get to the Q&A portion of this conversation. Second, please do not record the event because we're doing the recording and the plan is to make it available publicly at a later point. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Hendrik Spruyt is Norman Dwight Harris Professor of International Relations at Northwestern University. He's the author of The Sovereign State and Its Competitors, an analysis of systems change, Ending Empire, Contested Sovereignty and Territorial Partition, and Global Horizons, an Introduction to International Relations, and co-author of Contracting States, Sovereign Transfers in International Politics with Alexander Cooley. Jessica Auchter is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. She's the author of The Politics of Hunting and Memory in International Relations and Global Course Politics, The Obscenity Taboo. Patrick Jackson is Professor of International Studies in the School of International Service at American University. He's the author of The Conduct of Inquiry in International Relations, Philosophy of Science and its Implications for the Study of World Politics, and Civilizing the Enemy, German Reconstruction and the Invention of the West. He's also co-editor of Civilizational Identity, the Production and Reproduction of Civilizations in International Relations. Antje Wiener is the chair, holds the chair of political science, especially global governance, and at the University of Hamburg. She's the author of Contestation and Constitution of Norms in Global International Relations, A Theory of Contestation, The Invisible Constitution of Politics, Contested Norms and International Encounters, and European Citizenship Practice, Building Institutions of a Non-State. So without further ado, let me invite our speaker, Hendrik, to give us a talk. He has a fascinating PowerPoint slide ready. So Hendrik, please take it away.
Well, thank you. First of all, thanks to Ji Young, of course, for the generous invitation, but also to Jessica and Antje for being discussants. And I know Patrick wanted to be here, but apparently there's a bad reaction to the second vaccination, which seems to be quite typical. So hopefully he's on the mend. I'll be double tapped very soon with the rest of us. I do want to turn quickly to some of the PowerPoints because there are quite a few of them. I do want to try to stay within the 30 or 35 minutes that have been given. So if you bear with me, this is a very, I think we all know, not my preferred format. Zooms are very impersonal, and I see so many faces pop up. It's starting to resemble a 1960s disco with things flashing everywhere. So hopefully we can get through this. Let me see if I can share my screen with you and get on with the conversation. Let's see, where do we go? Here we are. Are we all okay? So everybody got that? All right, good. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the book. If you've had the chance to peruse it or even pick it up, it's pretty hefty. So there are going to be quite a few themes that I will not get to, but I will just try to highlight a few of those sort of objectives that I had in mind. I was trying to achieve in the book. So let me just say a few of the things that I was trying to get across. One objective of the book is to try to address some of the flaws or weaknesses of some of my previous work, which I've been criticized for being Eurocentric, not just me, but also the work of Charles Tilly and others, that particularly when we studied international societies and international order, a lot of the work had been focused on Europe. So I think there's something to be gained from looking at non-European systems, non-European international societies, just prior to sort of the European breakout, and see how they evolved in the interaction with the West as it gradually made inroads, particularly in my cases, into Asia. International societies, for me, are groups of polities that share particular views of political order. And I use the term international society and international order almost interchangeably, as you'll see if you read the book. I have to admit, in some ways, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, one returns to one's roots. And I was partially trained by John Ruggie, and I've gone back to perhaps some of the constructivist elements of thinking. And what I try to address in this book is, in my view, what I see as a positivist bias in Western political science. The attempt that social sciences should be similar to the natural sciences. We should look as best possible for law-like statements that unless things can be tested in a rigorous manner, they are less useful. And I disagree with that. I also believe that in our conception of international relations, we tend to be influenced by Newtonian and, in fact, mechanical views of international relations. So we think in terms of balances and equilibria. If China rises, then that must mean instability per definition, because the balance has been disrupted. I think that's a Newtonian mechanical influence. Now, the people have written about the influence of Newtonian thinking on political science in the 17th century, et cetera, and on, including one of my colleagues, Jim Farr. So that's another concept, another idea that I try to get across in the book. Third theme that I try to get across in the book is the idea that our perceptions of the West and of the European nation state have been influenced in a dialectical manner. My previous work actually had a more unidirectional focus. One sees the development of the Westphalian state system, and over time, that Westphalian system, through colonial expansion, becomes the global system. And I think I underplayed the importance of the particular conceptualization of the non-Western other in the construction of the Western nation state. So this book tries to look at this bidirectional encounter, if you will. And when you do that, it allows you to illuminate a little bit more starkly the particular aspects of nation state formation that I think most of us will be familiar with, right? In the nation state process, what are we doing? We're classifying subjects as citizens, which is already quite a change in terms of hierarchy and order. We engage in specific typologies. Who is a citizen? How do we categorize them? What religion do they have? What ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera? It is what Benny Anderson and others are focused on, this homogenization of this imagined community, or as Eugene Weber called it, the making of peasants into Frenchmen. How do we get to see this nation? How does it manifest itself as a territorial state? The importance of mapping practices, what Tongchai Wiener I think as a Benny Anderson student called the geo-body of the nation, right? That here is the nation territorially represented. And of course, this concept that authority is territorially bounded and defined. So when you think about these processes, I think they're implicated in how they also depict this external other, this non-Western other. All right, so there are a bunch of big themes, and you'll all be relieved to know that I'm not going to talk very much about those in general. I do want to highlight one particular conclusion that I drew out of these themes, and that is to come to greater realization about how heterogeneous and how flexible these empires were. So they deploy civilizational criteria, but they're actually flexible in practice. They are very diffuse aggregations of peoples, races, and religions. And the rulers of these empires themselves could be very flexible. So to give you one example, the Chinese emperor is Manchu, certainly in the Qing, the last Qing dynasty is Manchu. So he's Manchu, he's a Manchu warlord for his followers. For the Han meritocracy, because he had performed the rites, he is Chinese. But he also claims to be a Mongol Khan in the spirit of the Mongol subjects that he relates back to Genghis Khan and others of his lineage. But also towards the Buddhists and Tibet, he's also Bodhisattva. He's also the Chakravartin, the universal ruler. So depending on audiences, emperors and rulers would be multivocal and speak with a certain flexibility. The key point that I'll try to get across today is ultimately the highlighting of what I'll call collective belief systems. And it's a clunky concept, and I use different terms here. But really what I'm trying to get across is what the anal historians call the mentalité collective, the mentality of a given society at a given point in time, or what Clifford Geertz called webs of significance. And I'm trying to operationalize this as well. So not only to talk about collective belief systems and culture, but also to give them a particular empirical content. How did they work? How do we know that they existed, and how did they influence actions? A few caveats before I begin. To get this straight out of the way, of course, material factors matter, right? What Searle called brute facts. I'm not saying that material conditions didn't matter. Of course they do, balances of power mattered, etc. But they create permissive conditions. How we interpret and act on these material factors is influenced by social context, by historical interpretation. So one important influence here is the distinction that Searle draws between brute facts and social facts. And I'm going to highlight the importance of social facts in this discussion. And as I said, the second important influence are the anal historians. And in some ways, even Emile Durkheim already talked about collective mentalities, even though he's not on our list. But certainly Fernand Braudel, Marc Bloch, Jacques Le Goff, etc., work in this vein. And they particularly focus on feudal Europe. Why did feudal Europe have the particular political organization that it did? It's not easily translatable, but I think Chartier's description of mentalité is as good as any other. Schemes of thought, often unthought, internalized conditions that cause a group or society to share, without necessarily being explicit, systems of representation and systems of values. So an internalized view of how the world hinges together and how the political order should be constructed. The epistemology informing this is relativist. At the end of the day, I'm quite partial to Rorty's views of political science and social sciences, and one of my mentors, the many others, Miles is sitting around the table too, certainly another one, Peter Cowie, but certainly John Ruggie's relativist epistemology influences some of my thinking here as well. Focus of today's talk then, I just want to give you one example of how one might apply this mode of thinking. And the book actually started with a focus on the East Asian system that Ji Young has written about, and David Kang and others, and also focus on the Islamic world. And a few years ago, I organized with a historian colleague, Kaya Shahin, who's now in Indiana, a workshop at the SSOC Inter-Asia workshop in Istanbul. We could not find people working on Southeast Asia. There's, of course, Amitav Acharya working on contemporary Southeast Asia, but not too many people who looked at it historically. So that's why I started to delve a little bit into this. If you think in methodological terms, it's roughly a distinct case design, because it struck me as so different from the Westphalian state system. So I want to show you how this might work in the Southeast Asian case, and then show you the implications, the real, call it real world implications on political organization, but also in their conduct of what we would call international relations. Point of difference, just so we're all on board, of course, I think we all understand what the Westphalian state system is all about, even though it didn't start straight in 1648, we all know that. But that's the term we've given the state system. Sovereign actors are the key players in international relations. Authority is territorially defined, limited, mutual recognition. States are juridically equal, and there's no higher authority above the sovereign. All right, that's our point of departure then. That's what we're familiar with. As Monty Python would say, now for something completely different, the Galactic Empires of Southeast Asia. And the term is from Stanley Tambia, an anthropologist who studied this, but also Oliver Walters and others at Cornell have used this term. And if you think about a galaxy, it's actually quite an applicable metaphor, right? You have a core with gravitational pull being the strongest at that core, and then gradually disseminating out further with the gravitational pull declining. And if you think about that metaphor, that's also the Galactic Empire, with the core, the capital being the key center, with authority and power gradually diminishing over distance. Now, I'm going to argue that the Galactic Empires of Southeast Asia between roughly in the early modern period, between, let's say, 10th and 18th century, shared certain collective beliefs, that they had a shared view of what the polity is and what the polity should be. Shared view about the ontology of politics, but also the desired political order. And here I'm following, as I said, Tambia, Walters, but even Amitav Acharya has talked about this to some extent. The influence of South Asia in the collective belief systems of this part of the world, what Coed has called the Indianized states of Southeast Asia. For you specialists, I fully recognize the many local variations, right? There's an influence of animism, there's differences between mainland and maritime differences, but I do think we can still talk about a region that has shared particular views. We'll all be aware that, of course, Islam arrived from the 15th century on, but it is actually relatively contained. It's relatively contained to Indonesia and then specifically to Java. And in fact, if you look at the demographics, about 85% of Islamic followers would be within this Javanese perimeter. So relatively modest influence, certainly very weak influences on the mainland. So basic point, I'm going to argue that Hindu, Buddhist thematic patterns that influence the region, fully recognizing that there are local variations that change the particular inflection. The key point that I'm trying to get across is this idea that religion, cosmology, and politics all fuse together, that actors, populations, ruling elites did not distinguish between what was the desired cosmological view and the actual operation in practice, or what Heine Gelden has called the harmony between the empire and the universe. That is to say that the political organization is meant to be a mirror of the universe and of a cosmological belief, right? So here we're going to get a little bit into the weeds. Bear with me. Again, I'm not an anthropologist or specialist in this area, but I think I follow pretty well-established authorities in this, including Clifford Geertz, Stanley Tambia, and others. In this conceptualization, Mount Meru is both viewed as a physical presence and a metaphysical one. It is almost a view that, yes, it exists in reality, but it's also one of creation. So you have in different places of the world today too, Mount Merus that you actually go and climb and things like that. But the idea being that there is a metaphysical, cosmological universe with a mountain at the center. This mountain has multiple stratifications, different interpretations of how this is viewed, but in many interpretations, one of the realms consists of 4 kings at the lowest realm who guard the political order. Geographically, Mount Meru is depicted as having multiple seas, and in most instances, 4 mountain ranges. It varies a bit, but the number 4 comes up quite a lot. And I've emphasized the number 4 because there's going to be a sacred numerology involved. It sounds weird, but actually the numbers are going to matter for how the polity gets constructed. Then on Mount Meru, there's a supreme god, Indra, in this view, with multiple secondary gods at different layers, numbering 32 in all. So basically we have the number 33, 32 lesser gods and 1 superior god, Indra. And again, the numbers are going to matter. Okay, this is the general point, that the cosmological and religious views are not meant to be the representation of a particular physical reality. The image is meant to create that reality. It is the religious image, the cosmological image that will be used to try to create that cosmological and religious view into political reality. Or as Singh and Khan say, it's the endeavors to create its own reality based on imagery and cosmic numbers. So the cosmic numbers come into play in a variety of real world applications. All right. How do you make this manifest? How do people get to understand and realize this cosmological and very complex Hindu Buddhist metaphysical structures? One way of making this manifest is through the Mandela schematic. In the Mandela schematic, Mount Meru is the center. There's always a center in the schematic. And the center is surrounded by multiple squares. And the squares stand in for the continents that surround Mount Meru. And usually it has 4 entries depicting the 4 cardinal points. That's one way of representing the sort of the cosmological universe through this Mandela schematic with sort of a square-like representation. The mandala can also be depicted with concentric circles. Again, we have the ocean surrounding the center, so sometimes the mandala is depicted as a center with circles around it. And maybe some of you are familiar with, or at least the name, Kautilya, who was the advisor to Emperor Ashoka, who had unified the Indian subcontinent around the 3rd century. It's not quite clear whether the dating is actually accurate, but he had written the Arthashastra, the art of governing. And here he depicts the ideal alliance structure of a center and then circles around the center, etc. And Max Weber actually had read Kautilya and called him more Machiavellian than Machiavelli and the hyper-realist treatise. But here too, he's influenced by sort of this Mandela schematic of ideal alliance systems. And as I said, sacred numerology. So we already talked about this importance of the number 4 plus the center. So the center of Mount Meru plus the number 4 means 5. And you get multiples of this numerology, or what Shorter called the 2 to the nth pattern plus 1. So the numbers 5, 9, 33, 17, etc., are going to matter for how people want to structure the political organization. So it gets to be quite different from how we think about politics. It is basically inspired by these religious views and by these metaphysical concepts. All right, so here's the Mandela design in its simplest fashion. We have the center here, Mount Meru, some concentric circles depicting either the oceans, usually the straight lines depicting the mountain ranges surrounding Mount Meru, and then the 4 entry points being the cardinal orientation. And you're going to see this design appear again and again in architecture, in art, and as I'll show you, in political organization itself. You're going to get a few nice slides. It's PowerPoint. We all want some pretty pictures these days. Tibetan sand painting. The Mount Meru at the center, usually depicted as a lotus. We have the rectangular form, some circle forms around it. And what I like about this picture, I don't know if you can see it, please don't touch, which is the Tibetan sand painting. So yeah, that makes sense. All right, so much for art form. How does it all come into play in the political world? Angkor Wat, we'll all be familiar with the name at least. This is the aerial view of Angkor Wat. At the center, the highest tower with different levels to indicate stratification, right? The vertical stratus is Mount Meru, surrounded by 4 towers on its side. We have the rectangular structure here to depict the continents, and then the oceans here, the moat surrounding Angkor to represent the ocean surrounding Mount Meru. In short, the political structure, the actual manifestation of political power is meant to represent and stand in for the religious order. I should also say at this point, it is a 2-dimensional plane, but also a vertical plane. That is to say, you should read these depictions as horizontal. As you go closer to the center of power, you get closer to the tower, the Mount Meru, but it's also vertical. That Mount Meru is what Eliade called the axis mundi. This is the vertical connection because the king is the stand-in for Indra. The king represents Indra on earth. So this is then the axis of the world connected to the universe above, the connection between the sacred and the profane. The cosmological motive of Angkor Wat, if you can read with me, I know it's rather small maybe. The moat as a cosmic sea, the enclosure walls, sacred mountains around Mount Meru, 1 central tower, 4 towers around it, square rectangles. As you get closer to the center, you're also engaging not only the political authority, but you get closer to the religious center and spiritual power of the king. Quick aerial view of Angkor will show you the moat around it as well. It is also part of a larger complex because later a larger complex was built just to the northwest of Angkor. But again, you can see sort of the square, different biomes, different temples, all built on the same motif of vertical stratification. All right, not just in Angkor, but also this is the Borobudur complex in Java. Some Japanese influences here, but the basic structure is still there, right? More than 300 books have been written about Borobudur alone. We've tried to analyze the mathematical dimensions of Borobudur because there's all kinds of sacred numerology involved, as I said. So the numbers have to mean something in the whole arithmetic calculations of Borobudur. We have the center, we have the concentric circles, we have the vertical stratification, we have the rectangles around it. So this, not on the mainland, but in Java, as another example of what's going on here. Political organization. This is the Mancha Negara, the Mataram state on Java, roughly from the 16th to the mid-18th century until the Dutch finally wiped it out. But basically, it's built on this, what they've called a 5-4 constellation. So the Dutch encountered this particular polity, and it's structured as having a core region, center, with 4 regions around it. So you can depict it either as a set of squares or as a set of concentric circles around the center, the 5-4 model, the core satellite constellation. And this occurs not only at the top level, the central level of government, but also at village structures. So the Dutch recognize that a lot of villages have a center village and then minor villages all arranged in sort of this 5-4 pattern. This is another example in Malaysia, literally called sort of the 9 cities or the 9 villages. And this existed certainly through the 19th century, but wasn't really changed administratively to 7 districts in the 20th century. So here you had a core center, Sri Menanti, the capital, 4 minor regions around that, and another 4 around that. So the unity of the 9, literally the 9 cities or villages, 4 plus 4, again, is that sacred numerology depicted as real political administration. All right, a few implications of this. I'm sorry if I'm rattling on, but I'm trying to keep an eye on time. It is, of course, control over people, not territory. This is a network system of a center and lesser lords in these vassal regions that surround the center. It is explicitly hierarchical. The ruler is the Chakravartin, is the world ruler, the world conqueror. At least that's the claim, right? Because he stands in for Indra, the universal God. So the capital and the palace replicate Mount Meru, or what Clifford Geertz called the doctrine of the exemplary center. It wasn't just the political organization, it is actually the fusion of palace and temple and religious and political organization in one. The center is, as I mentioned earlier, the conduit between the sacred and the profane. The capital, Mount Meru, and the palace are the crux of the system, which to some extent explains why fighting over the capital is so important, even for symbolic reasons. Numerology, as I said, even enters into the organization of alliances. So Leonard Andaya talks about one perplexing case where the Dutch in the late 18th century are confronted by the 2 most important spice islands, Ternate and Tidore. And they want the Dutch to restore a kingdom which is basically doesn't exist anymore, Jailolo. And the Dutch said, well, why do you want that? They don't even, there's no real kingdom out there anymore. They've gone away. They've passed in the shadow of history. And Ternate and Tidore say, well, yes, but it was one of the 4 original kingdoms, together with Batyan, which did still exist. And we need Jailolo to be reinstated to maintain this cosmological balance. Further south in the Moluccan Islands, the southern Moluccan Islands, the Dutch encounter an alliance of the 5, an alliance of the 9, and they don't understand why do these numbers matter and why would you create an alliance that has 5 and 9? Is it given by material considerations, or do these cultural factors and these cognitive systems come into play as well? So just some examples where it looks different and atypical from our Western understanding of how alliance formation happens. There are other implications that come out of this. The minor vassals, because the symbolism of power matters so much, the minor vassals try to duplicate in their own right Mount Merus and palace temples. So you get these mini Mount Merus popping up in the smaller towns and even the villages. These are less in power, less in status, but they too try to convey this image of center and lesser powers, right? Even, go back to our galactic metaphor. Yes, there's the galaxy proper, but on a lesser scale, we could also think of our planetary systems. There's a core, there's a sun, satellites revolve around it. So if you will, want to drag this metaphor out, you could say, well, there's these planetary systems, and then there's the galaxy. Well, here too, you have lesser vassals with a core center and vassals around them. Concentric circles of power radiating out from the center, already mentioned Kautilya Shastra. Here's another example in political practice. This is the Ayuthaya Empire in Thailand, which existed till roughly the 18th century. Again, core and concentric organizational vassals. The shaded area here is the core region, and the number 4 here is the direct royal domain. Around that, in the number 3, I don't know if you can see my cursor going around, the number 3 are lesser vassals. These are usually second sons, because a king could have multiple wives. These were second sons. And then numbers 1 and 2 are first sons. So here's another concentric circle of vassals. It is the concentric design that Couturier talked about, with the vassals replicating the core. More pretty pictures. Here's the Aethiopian capital. Again, the Mount Meru design here, you can quite see the different layers. It is the highest tower at the center. In this case, 8 towers around it, 3 here, 3 there, 1 here, and 1 behind it. So you have the number 9, center plus 8, and gives you the number 9, obviously. All right. Bangkok. Bangkok's contemporary name apparently is the real, not the anglicized name, but its symbolic name, which is apparently the longest name for any city, which goes on. And this is a very small snapshot, but it is called the City of the 9 Gems. Again, the number 9, created by Indra, with the city given by Indra and resembles the heavenly abode. The symbolic name of Bangkok today. That's just one more quick example. Few consequences then of galactic imagination, all right, collective imagination. Obviously, authority is not defined in spatial terms. These are empires without end, right? They're ruled by the Chakravartin, universal ruler. Well, the universal ruler therefore can't admit to having territorial borders, right? Authority flows out as far as it can go. So consequently, there are overlapping spheres of authority. There's no clear definition of internal and external. Other rulers are not recognized as equals. The ruler is, after all, the world ruler. And this is quite typical, not just for Southeast Asia, but it's also true for the Chinese emperor who rules by the mandate of heaven. In the Middle East, at one point, there are 20 world conquerors all at the same time. I can talk more about how strange that is, but they all claim to be heirs to Alexander, Genghis Khan, and then Tamerlane, the 3 recognized world conquerors. So they have fictitious lineages, all relating back to Genghis or Alexander, but this claim to be universal rulers and world conquerors is quite common in early modern places. Now, here's an interesting feature to think about. At face value, you would say, well, look, if the center is the conduit with the sacred, well, then their power is pretty secure. The reverse is true. The reverse is true. The ruler rules because he has merit. So the moment he loses power, that's simply clear indication that he's lost favor. He must have been a pretender. Favor has passed clearly to the winner. So what you get is a constant infighting for power by these lesser vassals, by family members, etc., because it is the perfect tautology. If you win the battle, you have gotten favor. You are a man of prowess, all right? And the old ruler, too bad. Clearly must have been a pretender, lost favor, and therefore is done away with. If you want to think in terms of rational choice, which sometimes I'm more of an institutionalist, this is more of my constructivist project, but it certainly lends itself to principal-agent dynamics here, right? Because the capital is replicated by these lesser lords who have their own temple mount, right? Their own palaces. They have their own armies in some cases, right? You get the typical principal-agent problem that the agent has an incentive to defect and even overtake the principal if possible. Extreme high instability. In Angkor Wat, very few of the successions were by heirs to the throne, right? Same thing with Aethiopian Empire. Most successions were contested either by vassals, family members, or even outsiders. In this constellation, warfare is also considered to be sometimes symbolic, right? Sometimes it comes down to simply duels between the 2 main protagonists with the army standing aside, and you get these elephant battles. Sometimes, even when gunpowder starts making inroads and modern weaponry, the Dutch are perplexed, for example, why local rulers aren't using these gunpowder weapons. And well, no, these are much too valuable. They're nice orientation. They're ornaments. I put them on the shelf and we don't use them. So kind of ritualistic aspects in warfare as well. Whether there are few casualties is a matter of debate, and it has different points of views. Few general conclusions, and I'll wrap it up, and the discussants can go to work and no doubt take me apart. A few general conclusions. I've hoped to make plausible that, at least collectively, are important, that they matter for political organization and the definition in reality, that these aren't just simply cosmological religious views that have no bearing on how material reality unfolds. And they're often not just simply a reflection of material power, that they have an independent causal role to play in their own right. Contra Ken Walls, who we have learned many things of Ken Walls, but I always found his concept that we could understand the Greeks in the same fashion as we can modern Cold War dynamics. I found that always a little bit strained, in fact, frankly wrong, because I do think that the nature of interaction is historically and culturally specific and context specific. Another conclusion I tried to draw out of this analysis, which I haven't talked about much here today at all, but is sort of the fluid markers of identity, right? The fluidity that came in these multi-ethnic, multiracial empires we've lost today in sort of this creation of this nation state. And with that, I think a relative tolerance for difference in these multi-ethnic, multiracial empires. The Ottoman Empire is far more tolerant of Christians than the reverse. Same thing with many of the Chinese rulers. As I said, they could bring in Buddhists, Taoists, etc. In my view, I think too much of our modern political science is positivistic. I've criticized this trans-historical view of Ken Walls, who says, well, we can basically understand the Greeks in the same manner as the Cold War dynamic of the US and the Soviet Union. We too often think in terms of mechanical equilibria, right? If we have a rising power, there must be instability. I think John Mearsheimer is a great guy, great colleague, but the whole idea that because China rises, therefore we must have instability, I think there's far more complicated story there. It's not simply the balance of power, it's what's going on domestically and things like that. We tend to premise materialist understanding of authority and power. And what I've tried to do in this book is to show the independent role that can be played by cultural analysis. One other fact, and I am getting to the end of my story here, I think we tend to have a view that these early modern empires are like second best, that they were pre-state and now modernity has taken over and now we've all become nation states. And it's sort of this teleological best endpoint that we all would like to get to. Hence this notion that we have failed states and what we want to do is create nation states. So that's the ideal point. And hence we get into these policies of nation state building elsewhere without looking at local inflections and local factors on the ground. And we tend to neglect these hybrid forms of governance. I have to say that I've come to understand these hybrid forms of governance better, partially because of my graduate students, or graduate students that I have in common with Will Reno and others, who look at what look like clear failed states, Eastern Congo, and they show that no, there is some form of governance going on, even if it isn't the classical state system. Let me conclude, before you say, good God, Spruyt's going off the bandwagon here, and it's gone all the way cultural from his previous institutionalist rational choice points of view. We had Susan Rudolph as president of the APSA at some point, who was also at one point president of the American Sociological Association. And I like this quote, where she says, we work with symbolism, we work with our own cultural understanding and our own cosmologies. And because we've internalized them, we don't recognize them, right? This is what I meant with mentality collective. Let me conclude there. Apologies if I went on a little bit. Let me stop my share, and then we can see each other again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hendrik, for that great presentation. Without further ado, let me invite Antje for her comments.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Hello, everybody. Probably people coming in from different time zones, and I'm very pleased that this is kind of an acceptable time slot for the European contingent taking part. You're not like the ISA where you started a lot of the panels around midnight, but it was fun. And talking about virtual encounters, Hendrik, I think we were once introduced in the exhibition hall at the Oxford booth by certainly quite some time ago, but that's the time when we met. And now then I was really pleased to be able to read your book as a member of the International Theory Section Book Prize jury. And obviously there you had to come up against some 30 other books, and it's kind of, you go, when you're part of the group where you go into the second reading, then you're already on a good run. And I won't really criticize you very much. And I was really thrilled by this book. I have to say, it was good fun to read it, and I was glad. I've already recommended it to my students. I think some of them are in the audience, already used it for their thesis. I wanted to, I'll probably make kind of three observations. One, the key takeaway, which could be kind of towards grafting a global IR, which I think your book speaks to. Then some core observations made by the book, and I'll relate mainly to the theoretical point. So I'm very glad that you were so detailed with regard to your empirical research here in your wonderful presentation. And then I'll make some critical observations with regard to how do we actually introduce our books when we try to be critical vis-a-vis canonized IR, but nonetheless, we're kind of drawing on that particular framework in the way that we present our work. Now, obviously, the key point, the key takeaway, which I see so important for global IR is your global historical approach, and then also the bottom-up approach to understanding order. And that is, I think, really well explained all the way through, with relevance to theory, methodology, and politics of IR alike. And so I see the book in many ways. I mean, I'm certainly not an expert on Asia. I mean, if I know something about Latin America and Europe, so I'm not really familiar with the case that much, but I really read the book as an invitation to think differently, to think differently, to place ourselves along kind of a different dimension, because we talk a lot about trying to not think in a state-centered approach. So then we talk about non-state agents. So, but that's still state-related, and you come up with you kind of put collective beliefs at the center, and so then you get a kind of, you almost jump onto what I see as a kind of a moving picture that constructs artifacts. And with me, there was actually a lot of Tilly in the book, Charles Tilly, in terms of scripts and performances and repertoires. So not kind of less the books that you quote on the large structural changes, but more his collective action and claim-making behavior that I'm kind of interested in my sort of view on politics from below. Now, so you just came up with that towards the end, that you are offering sort of, you want to look beyond the Westphalian gaze, and I put behind that, indeed, exclamation mark. That's certainly something that the book does. And I think the key move, and that's where it's kind of I think your connection to the English school is sort of the strongest. And in other ways, it's not that particularly strong. Even though you sort of talk about an amended English school approach, I think you're much more developed than the English school. So understanding order in a sociological sense, and then international order entails international society. So you take a societal approach and talk about, and here I quote you, the international society consists of the social arrangement of polities that share collective imagination. And it defines what social and political relations are, as well as what they should be. So in that sense, I mean, you're already throwing the sort of ordering from below into the practice field, if you wish. And I think so the sort of the shared collective beliefs approach has a lot to say, there's a lot of kind of substance that you could further develop with the practice theory people in IR. So your approach then is interdisciplinary, which is very welcome, hermeneutic, historical. Interestingly, I mean, you draw on Searle, on Wittgenstein, on Gadamer, Ricoeur, then you bring in some of the nicest, or really the nicest quotations by Quentin Skinner on methodology, on Geertz and Charlene, and then the Annales come back in. So that's really big. And I see with these moves, I see a lot of what quite a few IR scholars currently are trying to do with global IR, that you already offer that. So I see a relatively strong connection there. And so your gaze beyond sort of the view beyond the Westphalian gaze then includes, and I quote, an engagement, as you said in the end, with early modern non-Westphalian international systems to reflect on how our own collective beliefs, our mentalité collective influences and indeed creates not only the international system, but the very actors that constitute that system. And it calls on us to reflect on who we are and how we understand the world. And in the presentation, you weren't as sort of focusing as strongly as you do in the book, that there is really a lot of interaction that interests you between the Westphalian sort of system and the other system that is sort of the early modern political order. So here, I think when I move towards the key observations, what I think is important to recall that the Westphalian system sees sovereign states as juridical equals and with territorial limits to authority, and therefore an important role of borders. We all know that, but we also know somehow that international law depends on this Westphalian system. So that's where I think the first major question comes up for people who like your book. What with international law? How do we actually then maintain international order? And how do we begin kind of rethinking the order that is too state-centered and therefore often leads to kind of cheap talk with regard to the norms of international law, that sort of all sorts of states are speaking to democratic norms, human rights, but then the implementation tells a different story. And that often has to do, as if we look at the Syria conflict, with borders and precisely the issue that the borders don't really represent the world as it is still. So then you juxtapose the Westphalian system with universalist systems, with reference to the Islamic world, to the Chinese empire and the dynasties in East and Southeast Asia. And I found that very helpful. There's so much work in the book, the way that you go into these systems and actually really do something different and dig out the material that helps us to understand how that ordering takes place. And I think, and I'm with you there, it's a very strong argument, but you point to the three pitfalls of canonized IR theory when you say, and I quote you there, I contend that such scholarship, A, misconstrues the non-Western world, B, misunderstands motivations in politics and individual action, and C, fails to recognize multiple sources of social order in international relations. And it could very well be, I mean, we talk about global IR for many reasons, with regard to decolonization, a sort of overcoming racial biases and so forth. But global IR might be actually necessary in order to be successful with climate governance politics. We see increasingly that the reliance on state systems doesn't help us with global climate governance and mitigating climate change. So here, the cultural understanding of international society that you offer, and the sort of the angle, the possibilities to deconstruct the myth about the Westphalian order, I think are pretty powerful. So in summarizing just a few critical, very minor critical reflections where it's almost funny, because I think all of us, when you write a book, you want to make a case, you want to contribute to the community of scholars, you wonder, you speak to colleagues, and I wonder whether your presentation with regard to sort of the three kind of realism, liberalism, and then conventional constructivism, whether that is really sort of, your opening of the story and sort of saying, oh, you're with constructivism. And then I quote you, my interpretation of constructivism thus points to the relevance of cultural analysis and intersubjective meaning. And here I would say, I just put behind that SIG. Well, that's what many of us have been doing for a long time. So this, I think since Millikan in the late 90s, a lot of critical constructivism, a lot of practice-based norms research is moving away from, from the kind of a very state-centric conventional constructivism, which is, I think, somehow the point where your kickoff point. And that's why when I hinted in the beginning at kind of the theories that I see your book speaking to are much more late modern or progressive than you would say in the book. I think you speak to a lot of the practice theory, to the critical constructivist crowd, to the global IR crowd, and so perhaps you're less English school and more kind of the really detailed empirical sort of Charles Tilly stuff on interaction. I think you talk more about interaction than intersubjectivity. Where you stress in the book, you say intersubjectivity, but I think it's really more an interaction between actors of a different kind that are part in the project of constituting international society. And I think I would probably recommend your book, and I've already started doing that in we just start classes here. And so I would read your book along with other books, such as Adler's most recent book on world order, Frost and Lechner on the large practices, Roy Smith and Phillips, Acharya and Buzan. And it's kind of these books I think should be read, Aisha Saragol should be read together. And that's, I think, my suggestion. And thank you so much to having me.
Thank you so very much, Antje. Let me go to, let's invite Jessica to share her comments, please.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the invitation to discuss this fascinating book. I think some of my comments nicely will follow Antje's comments, so it's a good ordering of comments. In many ways, I think this book is an endeavor to take on big theory in IR, and I liked the way it does so by unapologetically adopting its own interdisciplinary framework. And it is very unapologetically, and I appreciated that, especially in the introduction to the book. So I will begin my remarks by highlighting what I think are the three main contributions of this book, at least from my perspective. And then I'll raise some critical questions that are sort of intended to provoke further discussion, or perhaps gesture to some of the ways that this book can sort of be taken up in other sort of contexts or by others in larger conversation in the future. So the first sort of contribution, I think the book offers a much needed historically based critique of IR theory for its Western centrism and its Eurocentrism, and for distorting our view of non-European systems. it forces us to ask ourselves how our own political orders bias our understandings of the world around us and its history. As Antje said, there's a ton of work in this book. I think you kind of got a sense of that from the presentation that, that Hendrik gave. It's a rich empirical body of work here in the book. And I think it lays the historical groundwork to support a lot of contemporary post-colonial work, even though you don't situate the project overtly, at least, as post-colonial. Like Antje said, I think you might be more critical than you perhaps identify in the book, or the project itself might have more critical implications for a critical constructivism, and in this context, post-colonialism, which is a positive thing, that you're speaking to even more audiences than perhaps you at least first anticipated in the project, or how it's framed. But I think the specter of colonialism haunts your project along the margins in really interesting ways. After all, even if Westphalian states believed in bounded political authority, this only applied to equal recognition of other territorial states, not to non-territorial systems of order in Africa, the Americas, and the context that you look at, which you articulate in the book. I think one of the most interesting examples of this for me in the book is when you discuss how we should rethink Japanese imperialism as following the Westphalian model of civilizing the other, what you call colonial imperialism of the West, where Japan used the doctrine of sovereignty to their own benefit in regional politics. I think that's sort of a really interesting, just one brief example of what I mean here. I think one thing that interpretivist scholars struggle a lot with is precisely how to approach history. So to see such a rich interpretivist historical work being done in this book, I think it actually does a lot of empirical legwork for other scholars who may be seeking to make similar or commensurate theoretical arguments, but haven't yet sort of figured out how to engage the kind of deep empirical work the way that you do in the book. The second sort of contribution I see, which is a bit related, is the book's contributions to what might loosely be termed historical IR. One of the concerns I've always had of much of what falls under this label is that it trends positivist and problematically prescriptive, which is obviously one of your issues as well with this kind of work, and the kind of way that history becomes a data point for establishing a causal relationship from which we can or should predict fundamental ideas about the causes of war and peace. And this kind of dynamic that we see in a lot of historical IR tends to privilege a very particular understanding of history and a very particular type of history, which focuses entirely on states, reifies state centrism, and talks a lot about how war and peace is all about states rather than kind of the myriad of other ways in which it impacts individuals, et cetera. And a lot of voices disappear in this telling of history, which becomes a lot about trying to uncover truth than about something that's inherently contested. And I've always been sort of worried about the dynamics of historical IR in the context of whose history is really worthy of becoming data points. And I think what your book does really well is turn this on its head. And instead of beginning with the Western Westphalian system, as if it can be taken for granted as a concrete and finished idea, it begins with these three other systems of order and asks how their conceptualization as other in the West impacted the formation and functioning of the Westphalian state system. You critique the positivist approaches that have often led to reductionist portrayals of non-Western contexts. And I think it's really important to emphasize how significant it is to begin with the non-West, because it really allows you to question how other historians have rendered certain concepts translatable by using only Western framings. And it allows you to sort of argue that concepts, even ones basic to IR like war, may not mean the same thing across regional and historical contexts. But I think it also does something incredibly significant from like a sort of political perspective, like it's doing good politics by asking how voices from the non-West are translated into the very construction of knowledge and the delimitation of potential mechanisms of ordering. So I think your work is sort of like hotly political in that sense, in what it's doing by bringing some of these voices to the table in ways that are backed up by this sort of rich empirical context. The third sort of contribution I see is in complicating the way we understand political order, of course, in some ways arguing that social space, social values and ideals, and shared cultural assumptions are equally as significant as political institutions for considering systems of order in IR. and its political community and international society become equally important ways of understanding order. And I think that even though it is fairly implicit in the book, you're actually offering us the beginnings or the stirrings of an alternative understanding of sovereignty itself, which involves the potential of flexibility, which you gesture to in the conclusion of the book. So even though your focus is on political orders themselves, I think it has some important implications for the study of sovereignty and for the relationship between sovereignty and flexibility. That's like this really interesting discussion in the conclusion, and also the relationship between sovereignty and political order. So I have sort of a few, I'll say, comments and questions about that are intended to offer a more sort of critical engagement. The first is that given that collective consciousness or systems of order often themselves appear only as they are constructed to us, what types of cautions should scholars be aware of in thinking about these as systems of political order? There's been several critiques of the Westphalian system that suggest it's not so much a system as an origin myth for IR. So I'm wondering to what extent the same may be true for the three alternative systems of order that are described here. In what way is it necessary from an analytical perspective to take them a bit for granted as whole and in of themselves to be able to engage this analysis? Or what might it mean to adopt a more critical orientation toward the very idea of systems of order in the first place? Relatedly, one of the potential translations of mentalité collective that you talk about is civilizations. So I'm wondering how we escape the homogenizing nature of this conceptualization that so many have critiqued Huntington for. And I think in some ways your conclusions are not so different than his, that we've paid insufficient attention to culture as an ordering mechanism for international politics. I mean, the process and the other dynamics of your project are obviously very different, but the sort of core argument in the context of culture is not. So I'm wondering methodologically, how do we identify the boundaries of a culture given that it may be violent and heterogeneous inside itself? So there's no doubt, I mean, the book does excellent work tracing the dynamics of shared culture within these sorts of context, the three contexts that you describe. But obviously there's also mechanisms of shared culture between some parts of these and other areas that are not sort of included in the boundaries. So how and why do we place boundaries in specific places rather than elsewhere when we're talking about systems of culture, which is a very different dynamic than talking about territorial boundaries, but still a boundary sort of placing nonetheless. So what do we have to sort of assume, or what types of dynamics do we rely on in order to do this? And I'm thinking particularly of other scholars that might want to take up sort of similar types of work in understanding these kinds of mechanisms of order. So this is more of like a process question with regards to engaging this kind of scholarship. Another question I had is whether or not there's a danger to depicting the non-West as having political orders premised on cosmology and spirituality, and choosing not to engage this sort of notion that the Westphalian system might also be underpinned by that, or sort of leaving be the notion that the Westphalian state system is still one of states as rational actors acting in self-interest. I mean, I think that there's the beginnings of this a bit when you talk about how the Westphalian system is constructed with reference to an other, but the sort of tenuous or precarious nature of this construction isn't really the target of the book itself. So I'm wondering, if your aim is to explore how coherent sets of collective beliefs and imaginations influenced political orders beyond early modern Europe, what assumptions does that leave us with about the way in which they did or didn't influence political order in early modern Europe, and those sorts of dynamics? Lastly, one of the key processes you're interested in is how our own political orders bias our understandings of historical non-Western political order, which I think is the most interesting part of the book. I'm wondering to what extent this is a logic that is ongoing into the present as well. Like, we live in a Westphalian world, but it seems to be very provisional and contingent in many ways. You articulated this a bit with in mentioning in the presentation your students that are working on these kinds of hybrid notions of governance in various parts of the world. It seems like there are these various versions of political order but they're being deemed illegitimate or subsumed under frameworks like nation building or democratization. So what, if any, dominant concepts or conceptions about political order today prevent us from properly understanding non-Western political order in a modern context? I mean, this is not really, it's kind of an unfair question because obviously it's not within the scope of the book, but I do think it is a significant question for sort of those that are engaging with the rich work that's being done in the book, given that the book does, I think, have the potential to have so much relevance to the way we think about modern political order as well. I think it lays a lot of the groundwork for that type of work to be done and sort of theorized and thought through. So I'll just end by saying, I think the best books are not only are coherent in and of themselves in the work that they do, but also raise questions and debates that will provoke further research on the same sort of topics or processes. So I hope my questions here have indicated that for me, this book does exactly that. And I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So for those of you who missed the beginning part of today's event, Patrick Jackson, who was going to be another discussant, could not join us, but he shared his comments with me so that I can read them here. So I will try my best. Those of you who know Patrick, you can just imagine that I'm Patrick. Okay, so I will go ahead and read. I can say from personal experience that Hendrik Spruyt has been thinking about the ideas in this marvelous book for a very long time. When I was a graduate student at Columbia University back in the 1990s and was a student in Hendrik's course, we were chatting after class at one point about the different kinds of language games of political authority that existed in history. I was mainly contrasting sovereign territorial authority claims with Roman imperial authority claims, and Hendrik suggested that if I really wanted to see how diverse such claims could be, I should read up on Galactic Polities, and he recommended Tambia's 1976 book. That book features prominently in the discussions in chapters 8 and 9 of The World Imagined. So, this book has a history. We might draw a line of continuity from Hendrik's first book, The Sovereign Territorial States and Its Competitors, and even more directly from the dissertation version of that book, which featured even more material about the collective imagination of the so-called Westphalian polity. Even then as now, Hendrik was concerned with the ways that societies envision their political organization, what Max Weber might refer to as their way of legitimating rule, which inevitably and invariably means legitimating some kind of hierarchy in which some command and some obey. With that theme universal as a guiding thread, we can describe and compare different ways of culturally cashing out a ruling hierarchy, different logics of legitimation, different arrangements of rulers and ruled. We might then set them in some form of competition with one another. The competition for regional supremacy, as in Hendrik's first book, in which city-states, city leagues, and sovereign states grapple not only to dominate other polities, but in so doing grapple to establish their logic of legitimation as the logic of legitimation for all, or the encounter between what Hendrik persists in calling international societies in this most recent book. Hendrik's argument for holding on to the terms states and international when looking at ways of wording and the logics of legitimation beyond the European region is intriguing, but I think ultimately insufficient. And I want to linger on this point because I think it shows some of the challenges that an ambitious analysis like this has to confront. Hendrik redefines state as a form of polity that aggregates individuals above the level of chiefdoms and tribes, page 58, which is an especially striking redefinition because It emphasizes aggregation, which is more or less horizontal or gathering together of elements, rather than domination, which is invariably vertical. The above in Hendrik's definition is more classificatory than coercive, and a state for him is basically just a broader and more inclusive set. Now, a Weberian like me would do the opposite and focus on the vertical legitimate rule instead of the horizontal in looking to craft a conceptual category that could travel across time and space. This is, of course, not an either-or choice. Back around the time of Hendrik's first book, Yale Ferguson and Richard Mansbach suggested that the better term was polity, and that a polity had both vertical and horizontal aspects. I think that's correct, and for that reason, I would prefer to jettison the term state when talking about anything except the sovereign territorial form of rule characteristic of the European, US, as in American, USian political imagination for the past several centuries, and the actual practice of polities adhering to that model for maybe the last century or so. Once they gain the practical capacity to regulate and monitor the lives of their citizens. But what then of the term international? Justin Rosenberg has argued that the conceptual core of that term, and thus of the field as a whole, is the notion of multiplicity, a recognition that multiple centers exist and that the ways that they interact and engage in is consequential on all sorts of fronts. I myself have suggested that we ought to place encounter at the center of what we mean by international, so that the international aspects of anything catches up the element of an encounter with difference across boundaries. Hendrik's definition is someplace between those. Relations between different polities, even if the early modern polities were the very opposite of homogeneous nations. Page 59. It's interesting to me that Hendrik reaches here for the word polity and not the word state, and that he immediately points out that he will use the term interstate, international, and interpolate interchangeably throughout the analysis to, quote, remind us of preconceptions as we analyze the particulars of these orders, end quote. The vernacular vocabulary of the field already has semantic strangeness of the international relations between states rather than nations. And all of these attempted redefinitions seek to perform the kind of displacement or cognitive estrangement that we see in notions like global IR or even quantum IR, calling attention to our normalized vocabulary and making explicit the usually implicit conceptual equipment that it brings to bear. The question then is whether Hendrik succeeds in this endeavor. I would say that my verdict on that point is mixed. I think Hendrik succeeds in disclosing three rather different logics of legitimation rooted in different historical experiences and locations, different, that is, from the European USian experience and tradition. I would have been happier if he had referred to his reconstructions as ideotypical. The danger of the Gadamerean fusion of horizon language is that it can shade off into some sort of historical authenticity unless one is very careful. Whereas for my money, the Weberian, the admonition that an ideal type is always rooted in the cultural circumstances of the contemporary intellectual community can serve as a more dramatic displacement of the temptation to reification. The other way that Hendrik largely succeeds in this book is that he neatly illustrates the ways that the expansion of European international society narrative is largely too simplistic. There is a complex set of engagements and transactions out of which all sorts of normal hybrid forms emerge. And even though some of this is an unequal dialogue, in which one side has and deploys more effective coercive capacity. The capillaries of power keep notions in circulation, and we end up with polities that are neither fully one nor fully the other. If we think of the different logics of legitimation as ideal types, that is precisely what we ought to expect anyway. And the interesting finding is the specifics of particular combinations and concatenations. Where I wanted Hendrik to go further than he does is in turning his analytical gaze back on the European, US, and international society. There are, we might say, elements of justifications other than sovereign territoriality still in circulation there as well. For example, there are cosmological trappings of sovereigns and their representatives in putatively disenchanted democratic polities. What is sovereign recognition but a muted form of mythical ritual? And let's not forget that he has had sun kings, we have had sun kings and quasi-divine representatives, even up to the present day, with new populists claiming basically nothing but a channeling of the mystical essence of the nation and the very notion of the West, which Hendrik declares in a footnote, page 9, that he's only going to use a descriptive shorthand, is indigenous to the processes analyzed in the book, both the colonial dominance exercised by European, US-ian polities over other parts and peoples of the world, and the internal intensification of regimes of normalization and control over the citizens of those metropolitan polities. So there is a lot more similarity between the international societies that Hendrik analyzes and the usual US and international society of our scholarly field than might appear to be the case from Hendrik's account. All polities are mixed, even if they are dominant logics of legitimation. And the strength of ideotypical analysis is calling attention to the specificity of these practical combinations. So what this book is ultimately about is how collective beliefs, I don't have time to go into my skepticism about the very notion of belief and how the Wittgensteinian notion of a form of life strikes me as a more fertile way of getting at things. On all sides, shape and structure patterns of encounter and transaction. Hendrik moves us in international studies, I mean, and perhaps us in Euro-US-ian world tradition, a considerable way down the road to a displacement of our supremacist assumptions about our own dominant way of wording, but there is still more work to do. So this was Patrick's comments. So what I thought we could do, it's already actually 1:23. We are having such rich discussion. So if that's okay, I will actually open our discussion to Q&As, and then perhaps towards the end, Hendrik might be able to respond. And actually, he has kindly offered to hang out in the Zoom meeting even after the official end. So, given your schedule, if you have to leave at 1:30, please feel free, but FYI. So if you could raise your hand, I will actually try and see and read out your name so that you can go ahead and ask your questions. Boaz?
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Hendrik. This is fascinating. In my undergrad class, we just read the other week your Sovereign State and its Competitor. So that's will be a really great addition to that for the next iteration of the class. My question is, and I couldn't come here at the beginning of the talk, so maybe I missed that. So if you can talk a little bit about, and I haven't had a chance to actually read the book yet, so it's probably there. But if you can talk a little bit about the way in which these three different systems of rule, if you will, interact with each other, to what extent there was interaction and affection, and some ideas seeping from one to another, both, I would say, at the center, and maybe equally as interesting at the seams of them, because there's no, none of these systems had straight, hard borders, right? But they had large frontiers that sometimes, in which sometimes one would imagine there's going to be interaction between these different beliefs and rule systems. So that's would be fascinating to hear a little bit about what you find about some of these interactions.
Thank you, Boaz. If it's okay, why don't we go for Frieder and Fabian's question, and we'll stop here to hear Hendrik's response. Is that okay, Hendrik? Okay, Frieder, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Professor Spruyt, for the interesting talk, and as many here, I really enjoyed reading it. To keep it brief, I think one of the questions I have is if you are saying those are all types, all your cases are types of international societies or international orders, you use the term interchangeably. I think what I was wondering about, and maybe here I'm just coming from a slightly different epistemological point of departure, but how do we compare them? In what ways were they similar or different? You mentioned for your case in the presentation that the Southeast Asian system or the polities of Southeast Asia formed an order that was very different from the European system, but at the same time you get historians like Anthony Reid writing about the region, saying they had much more in common with Europe at the time than they had in common with the East Asian system that you also discuss. And so in maybe a question about how they're different or similar and on what dimensions we may be able to compare them. Second question to that is about, that gets back to then, the system or the society that you contrast them against, which is the European system. And the question here I have is whether by contrasting against this Westphalian ideal type, you are creating a system that in that ideal type form at the point of these encounters may not have existed exactly in those ways. So to what extent are you creating something here that may at this point have only been in its formative stages, not fully developed? I'll keep it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's go to Fabian, and we'll actually go to Hendrik to answer the question.
Okay, thank you very much. I also wanted to touch on the notion of global IR, what Antje Wiener had mentioned earlier, and also this notion of acharya of the global IR also means the study of world history, not just European history. Most of the IR literature that I've encountered basically had a case study frame from 1789 to 1990 on the European and North American continent. And I want to just agree with you real quickly too with your notion of saying that the rise of China, as Huntington and especially Mearsheimer have mentioned, that using Western templates like Wilhelmine Germany as a sort of case study for what they label as a Thucydides trap that might cause a future conflict. I want to just say that I really agree with your notion that it's too easy to pinpoint that, and using the rise of China out of a Eurocentric view, in my opinion, also is not something that we should approach. So using global IR or world history, my question is, how do we use those studies now that you have done, those case studies, and translate that to the modern world? So in other words, how do we balance or find a balance of using local history, world history, of getting a better understanding of a future global order in the real sense of global, that we are not continually falling into the trap of using this Western frame that we've used since I would argue probably since 1919 and then 1945 with the creation of the United Nations. So that would really interest me in that modern sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hendrik, please.
Gigantic questions. We're already 10 minutes over time. So thank you for sticking around. I realize these are busy times, end of the year for all of us. And it's been a hectic and trying year, I think, for just about everybody. Thanks, Jessica, Patrick, and for those of you who joined us late. Time zones, of course, trips everybody up. But Patrick couldn't join us because of his bad reaction to the second COVID, but I do appreciate his comments, and Antje and Jessica as well, of course. So these are great comments. I will address the questions from the audience, if that's okay, Ji-Young, because of time. Bo has a very small question about interactions between the three. Gigantic next book. A few points very briefly. One way of thinking about these interactions is the attempt by each of them to incorporate the other whom they encounter within the existing framework. So when the Chinese start to explore in the 15th century, they have massive maritime excursions to Africa and other places, they incorporate Southeast Asia as if they were tributary states. So even if the tribute isn't really taking place, that is how they are framed in the official discourse. And when the Portuguese and the Dutch appear, they too are labeled as tributary states. And I think that's typical, not just for the Chinese, but for all these others, that the existing framework is flexible enough to incorporate the other in a very malleable sense. And there's a great book that I like. It's called Luke Roberts. It's Performing the Peace. Really should be read by political scientists. When he talks about Tokugawa Japan and the ability of contradictions to coexist at the same time. So in the Chinese case, let me stick with that, you can classify all kinds of behaviors as tributary, right? So when the Chinese emperor is paying tribute basically to the nomadic invaders, the Liao, the Mongols, etc., he can depict that as benevolence by the emperor. He's giving something as the generous father. He is giving something away. So it seems to me that one way the interaction occurs is to incorporate the other within the existing framework, and the frameworks are very flexible. And as long as you don't challenge, for example, this notion of the tributary state, not a problem. It only becomes a problem when the British appear because they don't want to perform the rituals. So the Chinese can say, oh, the Dutch and the Portuguese are tributary states. They are part of the whole Confucian system. It's only when the British come and who refuse to do the ritual subjection, which is an open challenge. Maybe we're familiar with Elizabeth Dean's as-if politics. As long as you play the as-if politics, you can incorporate all kinds of other areas and other states. So that's one way the interaction, I think, studying interactions is interesting. The second way, how you study the interactions, that this flexibility also allows incorporation of other races and other ethnicities in a very flexible way. And I don't know if you were here when I was giving the example of, the Chinese case, but it's also true for the Islamic rulers, that while you have the official narrative that we are the Chinese emperor, etc., and we perform the rituals, in fact, you can be many things to many people, all right? So you can be Bodhisattva for your Tibetan subjects, you can be the Mongol Khan for your Mongol subjects, you can be the Manchu warlord for your Manchu warlords, and you can be a Han Chinese emperor because you've performed the rituals. Same thing here with the Ottomans. At the same time, they can claim to be true believers of the faith. In the meantime, most of the Grand Viziers were actually from Christian origin. And they can even employ Shia as high administrators in the Ottoman Empire on occasion. and you know, this fungibility that, well, as long as you don't openly challenge the system, and we can go through the performative rituals and the routine and the practices, as I think Jessica alluded to earlier, and Antje talked about practices, as long as the practice is performed as such, then in reality, the subtext allows you a bunch of different maneuvers. So that briefly by way of interaction. I know it's much too short of an answer, but what we have here is very limited time. Frieder asked the question, are they similar or different? Could you study these distinct empires and polities? It seems to me that they're all confronted in some ways. There are patterns that they all have to confront, right? I mean, I talked briefly, if you want the rational choice language, about principal agent problems, right? All these emperors have limited control over their vassals. Well, how do you control them? They have to find some means, and it varies per area. You can incorporate vassals, right? You can bring in Christians, as I said, as Grand Viziers in the Ottoman Empire. You can bring in foreign ethnic groups and incorporate them as Chinese and pretend they're Chinese. So all these areas have to deal with principal agent problems. They have to deal with the issue of multi-ethnicity, the multi-racial factors, and they have to find some means of making this work in a very heterogeneous and flexible pattern that I think the nation state no longer is able to do. So if there are lessons to be learned, and this goes a little bit into Fabian's question as to how do we put this to work in modern IR, we have to rethink about what we demand from nation and state building, this demand for homogeneity, rather than thinking through the particular modalities of heterogeneity that made these multi-ethnic and multiracial empires work. A variety of questions, not just these three, but also in the discussants. There is the long-standing problem about if you talk about collective consciousness and civilizations, are you basically being essentialist? And I've tried to avoid that by looking at local variations and variations over time and showing you how even within these systems, the flexibility itself defies sort of an essentialist interpretation. So in that sense, and this goes back to, I think, Jessica's point about how do you border them or boundaries. They don't have any boundaries in the very broad sense of the word, right? They might have fixed borders, of course, but also even geographical boundaries are very fluid. Where does one empire begin and another one start? It's a very open-ended question, and it's a civilizational question, right? Between Sunni and Shia, there is no boundary between Sunni and Shia. There's about a frontier zone about 100 miles wide, where today I'm Sunni, tomorrow I'm Shia. It depends on what's going on here. So yes, these boundaries are flexible. And there's that kind of flexibility and heterogeneity in these civilizational complexes, to use Annie Phillips's word, that I think is so distinct from the nation state, where literally authority stops at the border and not an inch beyond that, to use Benedict Anderson's term. Ji-Young, how do you want to proceed here? I mean, given that we're...
why don't
I'll stick around.
Yeah. Why don't I actually go to Danielle, who I believe was next, and then Keith. Let's get two questions at once, and then if you can answer them together, bundled, that would be great. Thank you. Danielle, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. The question I had just relates to the policy relevance point that you made in passing. And what I was wondering is, do you see it as an issue of policymakers having insufficient awareness of these hybrid or galactic political orders, or is there something else? Like, is awareness enough? So I would appreciate if you could elaborate a bit on how one would expect policymakers to take these insights and apply them around the world. Thank you.
Keith?
Thanks, really interesting. I had a question about at what level the collective beliefs are situated. And so you kind of have this notion that there is a macro order out there, you know, exemplified in the mandala. But, you know, it might also be that it's situated a little bit lower, or there's a range of beliefs. Like you mentioned also that these are polygamous societies and that there were a lot of first sons out there. That's a recipe for instability for sure, right? Like there are other ways of organized, that other shared beliefs, collective beliefs, that can have a significant influence on political organization that are not pitched necessarily at this macro numerological Mandela level. And I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on that.
Do I answer, Gio? Or
Yes, please.
oh, okay, good. Let's see. Daniel's question about policy relevance. Are political elites aware of these galactic empires? Let me rephrase the question. I think political elites work within we work in our own collective consciousness where we think it is the nation state, and the nation state system is the preferred model. And at the very end of the talk, I was talking about the notion that we don't recognize these hybrid governance structures. My colleague William Reno is there too. Here I've, particularly Will's students have looked at these hybrid governance structures in Africa and other places. So, one bias that slips in is that we're not aware and we don't know how to deal with these hybrid governance structures, and we relegate them as failed states rather than recognizing how they might work in some form of governance and bring some modality of public goods to these areas. So are political elites aware of these? Well, which political elites are we talking about? And today, I'm not sure there's much historical consciousness going on at all. But I think that unfortunately is something that would be difficult to address. But certainly, Harvard colleagues like May and others have looked at the importance of studying history and trying to see how we appropriate history for good or for bad, and how we deploy that in practical policy discussions. So one policy relevance question then I think is this notion of our discourse about failed states, which I think is mistaken, but also this idea of how we approach diversity within the nation state. It also goes a little bit to Antje's question about international law, because in this encounter between the West and these non-Western polities, international law is partially invented by making the other as not an actor within international law. So international law defines in the 19th century who the legitimate actors are. So I do think there's a direct policy relevance there and how international law gets constructed. Keith, great question, right? This is the one I also grappled with myself. And I've tried to indicate a little bit how it seems to me that I've tried to show how these collective beliefs operate at different levels and actually reinforce each other. So when I was discussing the Indonesian case, this 5-4 structure of the Mancanegara state in the 17th, 18th century, it's also something that you found in the village level up and through the 20th century, that you would have this 5-4 configuration of a central village and others around it. So some parallels between the lower level of political organization and higher levels. With regards to the East Asian case, there too, and Ji Young would be much better to speak on this than I, but the parallel between the familial organization, the father-son relation, is also the one that gets transposed to king and subjects, right? That at the higher level, the highest political level, it's simply an aggregation upward, if you will, of what exists at the patriarchal level of a family organization. And even the emperor, when he talks to the vassals, it's the father-son relation. So yes, he's in control, but he also has to be the benign father. So stern sometimes, but also benign in dealing with his children of various types. So you see sort of these parallels at different levels. Is the whole story complete? There are different narratives. And then you'll have to figure out, am I persuaded at the end of the day by the contextual description that this is really what motivates a particular society or not? I've tried to look at different things such as architecture, art, and say, well, these are motifs that exist at various levels and in various disciplines. And from that, I try to distill a whole. The analysis historian approach here actually is the one that I do find quite useful, because if you really want to fill it out, the anal historians are looking at all levels, right? From the very material one, from eating habits, building habits, who had windows, who didn't? Oh, well, the Netherlands, lots of windows here in the 15th century. So that indicates relative equality among people rather than a hierarchical situation, right? And things like that. So you can look at many, many factors to try to distill what is a sort of practice in a given society. Right. but it is a question we grapple with. Absolutely. Great question. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Are there any further questions? No. Okay. This will conclude our event, official event. Thank you so very much, Hendrik, and our amazing discussant and everyone for joining out of your busy schedule. And thanks to Christiana, who has worked so hard from behind the scene to make this possible. So thank you so much, everyone. And Hendrik actually will probably stay for another hallway chit chat for 5 minutes or so, especially for our grad students and colleagues. So we will stop recording. I don't know when it stopped it. So if you want to just stay to say hi, please